Hampshire, late September, 1817. Her mother arrived at Brimsfield Hall on a Wednesday afternoon, which was not the day anyone had expected, and was therefore the day that confirmed everything Cassia Renward had been hoping was too subtle to notice. Her aunt, Lady Brimsfield, had sent for reinforcements. Women like Aunt Phoebe did not summon a sister from Bristol, unless a situation had moved beyond the reach of supper arrangements and strategic seating. And the situation, as Cassia understood it, had moved considerably. She had been in Hampshire for 6 weeks. The invitation had been genuine enough. Her aunt had a large house, an autumn calendar, and the conviction that her niece, at 23, required broader society than Bristol's merchant circles could supply. What her aunt had not anticipated, and what Cassia herself had not entirely governed, was the Duke of Haldane. Haldane Park sat 4 miles east of Brimsfield Hall. The Duke was 31, unmarried, and private in the manner of a man who had watched a title inflict damage on his own father, and had resolved to carry his more carefully. He was known throughout the county for 2 qualities. He was perceptive, and he was guarded. The county considered these the same thing. Cassia, across 6 weeks and 3 dinners, and 1 conversation about coastal engineering that had lasted past midnight, had concluded they were not. Her mother was here because someone had reported the midnight conversation, or the way the Duke's attention followed Cassia through the harvest supper with a quality he had not authorized, or perhaps her aunt had simply recognized, with the instinct of a woman who had survived 30 years of county society, that her niece had stopped treating Hampshire as a diversion and had begun treating it as a question she intended to answer. Cassia was in the upstairs sitting room when the carriage came up the drive. She set down her pen, looked at the familiar crest on the door, and understood, with the precision she brought to every important calculation, that the next 2 days would determine whether she left this county with her dignity or her heart, because her mother had arrived to ensure she did not leave with both. The farewell dinner was held Thursday evening. 16 guests, arranged with the precision of a hostess performing a conclusion. Cassia was seated between Sir Haddon Cartwell and the vicar's wife, 4 places and a candelabra from the Duke, which was the social architecture of a separation already decided. She wore dark blue, the shade her mother called unnecessary, and her brother called deliberate. She wore it because it was her last evening in Hampshire, and she had resolved, sometime between the carriage and the drive and the dressing bell, that she would not make this convenient for anyone. The Duke arrived at 7. He entered with the controlled attention of someone who had been preparing for this room, and he looked at her, and the look lasted 1 second longer than it should have, and then he turned to Lady Brimsfield, and the evening began. They did not speak until the withdrawing room, in the unmanaged space between the port and the music, when the room forgot its arrangements and allowed them to stand at the same window. "I understand you leave for Dorset," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. He was quiet. She watched him construct his next sentence, with the care of a man choosing which truth would cost him least. "Miss Renward," he said, "your time in Hampshire has been—" He paused. "You have been an exceptional guest." Guest. She heard the word and understood everything it was designed to carry. "But you will appreciate," he continued, his voice dropping below the social register into something more private and more fortified, "that certain situations, however agreeable, become complicated if they are permitted to extend beyond their natural term." She studied the architecture of a sentence, built to sound like reason and function like a locked gate, and she understood, with a clarity that cost her something she would never let him see, that this man was not ending a connection. He was refusing to acknowledge one existed, and he was using the word guest to accomplish it, which was the most precise wound available to someone who knew she had no claim to Hampshire, except whatever he might have offered, and had chosen not to. She held his gaze. She allowed him to see, clearly and without performance, that she had understood everything. The word. The wound beneath it. The wall he was building between them from the bricks of courtesy. "I have been an exceptional guest," she said quietly, "and I understand the natural term of things perfectly." She turned from the window. She walked across the drawing room without adjusting her pace and without looking back, and when she reached the doorway, she paused for 1 second, her hand resting on the frame, and then stepped through and drew the door closed behind her. Not sharply, not with force, with the quiet, deliberate sound of a woman who understands the difference between a door closed against her and a door she has chosen to close herself. On the other side, she kept walking. Behind the closed door, the Duke of Haldane remained at the window, and the room continued around him, and 16 people carefully did not notice that something in the evening had shifted, and that the man at the window had not moved at all. Her brother Ivo was waiting in the entrance hall with the patient stillness of someone sent to Hampshire to escort his sister home, and who had spent 3 days understanding exactly why the escort was necessary. He said nothing until they were in the upstairs corridor. "Well?" "We are leaving tomorrow," she said. "As arranged." "I meant the dinner." The dinner was 16 people performing a farewell that suited everyone except the 2 people it concerned. She stopped at her bedroom door. "He called me a guest, Ivo. 6 weeks, 3 dinners, a conversation about coastal engineering that outlasted the candles, and he looked me in the eye and called me a guest." Ivo had their father's face and their mother's instinct for silence, and he used both now, letting the quiet do what questions would have interrupted. "He meant to protect himself," she said. "He used the word guest the way other men use fences, to mark where the safe ground ends." She paused. "I understand why he did it, and I do not intend to forgive it quickly." Ivo was still for a moment. "He watched you leave, from the drawing room window. I saw him from the garden. He stood there a long time after the door closed." Her hand rested on the door handle, and she did not turn it. "It does not matter how a man watches you leave, Ivo. It matters entirely what he does after." She opened her bedroom door, stepped through, and closed it behind her, and did not say what she was thinking, which was that she already suspected what the Duke of Haldane would do, and that she was not at all certain she was prepared for it. She arrived at Briarstone on a Friday afternoon in the first week of October, with her brother, 2 trunks, and the focused energy of a woman who had decided that if she was going to be exiled, she would make the exile productive. Briarstone sat on the Dorset coast, a mile above the village of Saltmere, on a bluff that looked south toward the sea and east toward nothing in particular. The Renward family had owned it for 11 years. Her father had bought it as an investment, visited twice, and delegated its management to a local steward who had interpreted delegation as permission to do very little. The house was sound but neglected. The grounds were passable. The orchard behind the east wing had not been properly tended in 3 seasons, and the sea-wall along the lower fields showed the kind of cracks that began as suggestions and ended as emergencies. Cassia walked every room on the first day. She walked the grounds on the second and the third. By Monday morning, she had a notebook full of observations, a preliminary plan for the orchard, and a problem she had not expected, which was that the sea-wall was worse than it appeared from the bluff, and the lower fields would flood by winter if the foundation was not addressed. She was standing on the sea-wall on Monday afternoon, studying the cracks with the focused attention she had brought to engineering conversations in Hampshire, when Ivo found her. "There is a carriage on the coast road," he said. She did not look up from the wall. "Whose?" "I think you know whose." She looked up. The carriage was still a quarter-mile distant, moving along the road from Wareham, and she could not yet see the crest on the door, but she did not need to, because she had known since Thursday night, since the moment she closed the drawing-room door behind her, that this was a possibility, and she had spent 3 days deciding what she would do when possibility became a carriage on a Dorset road. "He came himself," Ivo said. There was something in his voice she chose not to examine. "Yes," she said. The carriage reached the Briarstone gate at 3:30. The Duke of Haldane stepped down into the October afternoon and stood at the iron gate and looked up at the house on the bluff, and then at Cassia, who was walking down the path from the sea wall with her brother, and with the composed, unhurried pace of a woman who was not going to run toward anything. She reached the gate. She did not open it. He stood on one side. She stood on the other. The ironwork between them was old and heavy, the kind of gate that had been built to last and had outlasted several intentions. "Miss Renward," he said, "Your Grace." He looked at the gate between them. He looked at the house behind her and the sea beyond that, and the considerable distance between Hampshire and Dorset that he had covered in 3 days to stand on the wrong side of a gate she was not opening. "You left Hampshire," he said. "I was removed from Hampshire," she said. "There is a difference, and I expect you to understand it." The October wind came off the channel and moved through the space between them, and he looked at her with an expression she had not catalogued before. Not the guarded one, not the careful social attention. Something that lived before those. Something that arrived before he had time to manage it into a position. "I came too," he said. He stopped. He looked at the gate. "May I come in?" She thought about the drawing room door she had closed. She thought about the word guest, and about a man who had watched her leave through a window and had not moved, and who had now moved a very great distance and was standing at her gate with an expression he had not organized into anything safe. "No," she said. Something shifted in his face. "Not today," she said. "There is an inn in the village, the Saltmere Arms. Mrs. Sorrel keeps it well." She paused. "If you are still here tomorrow, I will know something worth knowing about why you came." She turned from the gate. She walked back up the path toward the house with her brother, who said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the gate had not already said, and the Duke of Haldane stood on the coast road in October and watched her walk away and did not leave, and the gate between them remained exactly as she had left it. He was still there the next morning. This she learned not from Ivo, who had the discretion to wait until asked, but from Mrs. Sorrel, who arrived at Briarstone before 9 with a basket of eggs and the transparent purpose of a woman delivering intelligence. "The Duke of Haldane," Mrs. Sorrel said, setting the eggs on the kitchen table with the careful arrangement of someone preparing the opening of a longer conversation. "Took supper in the private dining room, asked about the tide patterns, and requested breakfast at 7. He also asked about the seawall." Cassia looked at the eggs. "He asked about the seawall. He walked the lower road this morning before 8. I saw him from the dairy." Mrs. Sorrel paused with the economy of someone who had been the most informed person in Saltmere for 2 decades and understood the strategic value of a well-timed silence. "He was studying the cracks." Cassia said nothing. She thought about a man who had called her a guest in Hampshire and had traveled to Dorset in 3 days and was now examining her seawall before breakfast. And she thought about what it meant when someone who built walls of his own arrived at your property and went straight to the ones that were failing. She found him on the lower road at 10. He was standing where she had stood the day before, at the section where the largest crack ran from the base to the waterline, and he was studying it with the focused attention she recognized from Hampshire. The kind that arrived before the guarded expression. The kind that meant he was actually thinking rather than performing the appearance of thought. "You have a structural problem," he said without turning. "I am aware of my structural problem," she said. He turned. He met her gaze in the October morning with the expression she had not permitted herself to study in Hampshire, because studying it would have required admitting what it was. And here in Dorset, on her own ground, with the sea behind her and the wall crumbling beneath them both. She studied it anyway. "The foundation has shifted," he said. "The crack is not surface damage. The base has been undermined by tidal action over several years. If it is not addressed before the winter storms, you will lose the lower fields." "I reached the same conclusion yesterday," she said. "Then you know it requires a contractor who understands coastal foundations, and that the work will not survive until spring." "I know it requires a contractor, funds, a tidal survey, and access to stone from the Adderley quarry, which sits on land belonging to a lord I have not yet met." She paused. "I also know that I have managed to identify the problem, assess its severity, and begin planning the remedy without assistance from Hampshire." The sea moved behind the wall with the steady indifference of water that would arrive regardless of what anyone decided about stonework. "I am not here to assist with your seawall," he said. "Then why are you standing on it?" The October wind moved between them, and the crack in the foundation ran beneath their feet, and neither of them was entirely discussing engineering. "Miss Renward," he said, "I came to Dorset because I made an error in Hampshire that I have been unable to resolve by any means available to me, and I have considerable means. I called you a guest. You were not a guest. I have spent 3 days trying to identify the correct word, and I have not found it, which is why I am standing here rather than writing a letter, because a letter requires knowing what to say, and I do not, and I thought perhaps if I came, I might." He stopped. He looked at the sea wall. "You might what?" she said. "I might learn it," he said, "by being here, rather than by considering it at a distance." She was quiet for a long time. The sea moved. The wall held, for now. "If you are staying in this village," she said, "you will not court me. You will not perform regret in my drawing room or treat your arrival as a romantic gesture I am expected to find charming." She met his eyes. "If you are here, you will be useful. The sea wall needs rebuilding. The orchard needs surveying. The tenant cottages on the East Ridge need repairs that should have been completed 2 seasons ago. I need competence, not courtship. If you can offer the first without inflicting the second, you may stay." He looked at her with an expression that had moved past the guarded one into territory she was going to have to reckon with eventually. "And if I can? Then we will see what remains when the work is finished." He extended his hand. She looked at it. The hand of a duke, offered across a cracking sea wall, in the manner of someone agreeing to terms he had not written and did not control. She shook it, briefly, firmly, without ceremony. "The quarry," she said. "Lord Adderley, can you arrange access to the stone?" "I can have it arranged by Thursday," he said. "Wednesday," she said. "Wednesday," he agreed. She turned back toward the house. He remained on the seawall, looking at the crack in the foundation, and at the sea, and at the figure of a woman walking uphill, who had just governed the terms of his presence in her life, with the precision of a contract and the weight of something far larger. Saltmere noticed. Dorset villages of this size operated without the elaborate social machinery of Hampshire or Kent, but they compensated with the efficiency of proximity, and by Thursday, every household in the parish knew that a duke was lodging at the inn, that he had been seen on the seawall with Miss Renward, and that he had walked to the Adderley quarry on Wednesday morning and returned with access to stone that Lord Adderley had been refusing the village for the better part of a decade. This last detail impressed the village considerably more than the title. Mrs. Sorrel, who functioned as Saltmere's primary intelligence service without the inconvenience of formal appointment, delivered reports to Cassia with eggs, with bread, with the afternoon parcel of fish, and with the serene authority of someone who considered information a public good. "He carried timber," Mrs. Sorrel said on Friday. setting a wrapped bundle of mackerel on the kitchen table. From the lower yard to the wall site, with Mr. Prentice and the Holt boy, he removed his coat. Cassia did not look up from the drainage survey she was reviewing. He is helping with the seawall, as agreed. He is carrying timber, Miss Renward, with his sleeves pushed back. The Holt boy did not know he was a duke until Mr. Prentice told him, and the boy said, and I am quoting this faithfully, he said the man does not carry wood like a duke. Cassia permitted herself a small expression that was not quite a smile. He also inquired about your orchard, Mrs. Sorrel continued. Spoke to old Gareth about the grafting schedule, asked informed questions. Gareth said the man knew his varieties, which is not a thing Gareth says about anyone, as you will discover when you speak to Gareth yourself. Cassia set down the survey. Mrs. Sorrel, the Duke of Haldane is here to be useful. He's being useful. That is the full extent of the arrangement. Mrs. Sorrel regarded her with the steady, unhurried assessment of someone who had buried one husband, raised 4 children, and operated the only inn in a coastal village for 18 years, and who had, in that time, developed a comprehensive understanding of the difference between what people declared about their arrangements and what their arrangements actually were. Of course it is, Mrs. Sorrel said. The mackerel is very fresh today. I would do it with lemon. She left. Cassia returned to the drainage survey and found that her attention, which she had been directing with considerable discipline, had developed an inconvenient tendency to drift toward the window that overlooked the lower fields, where a man without his coat was carrying stone along a seawall he had no obligation to repair, for reasons neither of them had named, under terms she had written, and he had accepted, without a single negotiation she had expected him to attempt. She closed the survey and did not look at the window again for the rest of the afternoon. With moderate success. The seawall work had been underway for 10 days when the storm came early. Not the winter storms. An October squall, the kind that arrived from the southwest without warning and reminded the coast that the sea kept its own calendar. The lower field flooded overnight, and by morning, the new stonework at the base of the wall had shifted, and the drainage channel Cassia had been planning became urgent rather than theoretical. She was on the wall at first light. The Duke arrived 20 minutes later, on foot from the village, in a coat that was wet and practical and had been put on in haste. He said nothing about the hour or the weather or the fact that no one had sent for him. He appeared at the wall and began working. They worked for 3 hours in the October rain, directing Mr. Prentice and 2 laborers on the emergency shoring, moving stone, checking the tidal channel, making decisions together with the compressed efficiency of 2 people who thought about problems in the same language and did not need discussion to coordinate. It was during a pause, sheltering under the wall's overhang while the rain intensified, that the conversation shifted. Your father, she said. She had been considering how to raise this for a week, and the rain had stripped away the social architecture that made the question difficult. You spoke of him during that conversation in Hampshire. You said the tidal had caused damage. You did not say how. He was quiet. The rain fell with the heavier sound of coastal weather, carrying salt. My father married for attachment, he said. He used the word with the careful weight of someone who had been taught to be precise about it. She was the daughter of a textile merchant in Gloucester. The match was considered remarkable by everyone who did not have to live inside it. Remarkable, she said. The county never forgave him, not publicly, but privately, in the ways that accumulate, in the invitations that stopped arriving, in the conversations that changed register when she entered a room, in that particular quality of politeness that is worse than rudeness because it never offers you the dignity of a clear insult. He paused. My mother spent 20 years being tolerated by people who believed she didn't belong among them. It didn't destroy her, but it diminished her. Quietly, year by year. I watched it happen. Cassia was still. The rain moved. The seawall held beneath them, shored and imperfect. "And so you decided," she said, "that attachment across that line was a cost you would not pay." "I decided it was a cost I would not ask another person to pay," he said. "That is what I meant in Hampshire. Not that you were beneath me, that the distance between us would become a weapon other people used, and I did not want to be the one who handed it to them." She looked at the man beside her, under a crumbling wall in the rain, who had just explained his cruelty as an act of protection and meant it completely, and who was not wrong about the weapon, only wrong about who should decide whether it was worth the wound. "Your mother," she said. "Did she regret it?" "I asked her once, near the end. She said she regretted the cost. She did not regret the choice." Cassia looked at the stone they had shored that morning. The new work fitted against the old, holding where the original had failed. "Come inside," she said, "when the rain stops. The kitchen is warm and Mrs. Holt left a stew, and you have been carrying stone since dawn, and you are going to eat something before you walk back to the village in this weather." "That is not an invitation to the drawing room," she said. "It is an instruction to the kitchen. There is a difference." "There is," he agreed. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that she was not going to identify as a smile, because doing so would require admitting she had been watching for it. The rain stopped at noon. She opened the kitchen door. He stepped through it. They sat at the scrubbed table with the stew and the survey maps and the salt wind still in their coats, and talked about the wall, and then about the orchard, and then about a passage in a book on tidal engineering she had on the library shelf, and he had read twice, and neither of them mentioned Hampshire. And the afternoon was entirely practical, and entirely something else, and neither of them was ready to name which portion was which. The parish meeting was held in the Saltmere Church Hall on the last Saturday of October. It had been called to discuss the seawall repairs, which had become the village's primary topic of conversation, primary source of employment, and primary entertainment, in roughly that order. Cassia had organized the meeting. She had written to every landholder in the parish, prepared a full-cost accounting, drawn up a schedule for the remaining work, and arranged for Mr. Prentice to present the engineering assessment in terms the village could follow. She had done this with the methodical attention she brought to everything, and with the particular determination of someone who understood that competence, demonstrated consistently, was the only currency that held its value in a community deciding whether to trust her. 30 people attended. The hall was full, which was notable for a parish meeting about stonework, and Cassia understood that the attendance was not entirely about the wall. The village had been watching her for 3 weeks. They had been watching the Duke for the same period. Opinions had formed, and the meeting was the occasion on which those opinions would be tested. She presented the accounts, standing at the front of the hall, with the survey maps pinned to the wall behind her, and the focused clarity of someone who had been attending her father's business meetings since she was 15, and understood how to hold a room. The questions were reasonable. Mr. Holt asked about the tidal timing. Mrs. Prentice asked about the drainage channel. Old Gareth asked about the orchard runoff affecting the lower wall, and Cassia answered with the specific detail that earned her a nod from Gareth, which Mrs. Sorrel later described as the highest distinction available in Saltmere. Lord Adderley arrived late. This was deliberate. Cassia recognized the strategy with the automatic attention she brought to rooms and to men who entered them with performance rather than contribution in mind. Adderley was 57, a baronet whose estate bordered Saltmere to the north, and whose quarry had supplied the stone for the wall repairs under an arrangement he had agreed to at the Duke's request, and had been regretting ever since. He was the kind of man who had occupied a position for 30 years, and had mistaken its duration for its merit. He listened to the remainder with the attentive smile of someone preparing his moment. When Cassia opened the floor for further discussion, he stood. "Miss Renward," he said, and his voice carried the room with practiced projection. A most thorough presentation. Most thorough, indeed. Thank you, she said. One does wonder, however. He paused. The pause was engineered to gather attention, and it succeeded. Whether a visitor to the parish, however industrious, is perhaps assuming responsibilities that might more properly rest with those who hold a longer standing in the community. The room was quiet. The seawall has been failing for 5 years, she said. The community is welcome to identify anyone of longer standing who has addressed it. There was a ripple in the room that was not quite laughter and not quite applause, and served the purpose of both. Adderley's smile tightened. I merely observed that 3 weeks of enthusiasm, however well supported by a merchant's capital, does not constitute the kind of understanding that this coastline requires. Some problems benefit from the perspective of people who have lived alongside them for generations. He did not look at the Duke, who was standing at the back of the hall, where he had been for the entire meeting, silent, and whose silence carried a weight that Cassia had learned to recognize. Lived alongside them, she said evenly, and done nothing. Adderley's expression shifted. He opened his mouth. The engineering assessment, the Duke said from the back of the hall, and his voice was not raised, and it did not need to be, because it carried the room the way a tide fills a harbor, not with force, but with the simple authority of everything behind it, was conducted by Mr. Prentice, who has worked this coastline for 22 years. The title survey was commissioned and funded by Miss Renward from her own accounts. The quarry stone, which Lord Adderley generously supplied, was selected on the basis of a geological analysis that Miss Renward sourced from a specialist in Portland. He paused. The hall was entirely still. The wall is holding. The lower fields are dry. The drainage channel is functional for the first time in 3 seasons. He turned to Adderley with an expression that had none of the guardedness and all of the weight behind his name. The perspective Miss Renward brings is the perspective of someone who identified a problem, devised a solution, funded it, and delivered it. I am not aware of a qualification that outranks results. Adderley sat down with the controlled dissent of someone who had been publicly corrected by a duke and understood that the correction was permanent. The meeting continued. Cassia completed the remaining business with composure and did not look at the Duke at the back of the hall, and he did not look at her, and the room understood everything that was not being exchanged. Afterward, outside the church hall in the October dark, Mrs. Sorrel appeared at her elbow. "He did not defend you," Mrs. Sorrel said. Cassia looked at her. He listed facts, engineering assessments, tidal surveys, geological analyses. Not a single personal word about you. He made it entirely about the work. She paused. Which meant Adderley had nothing to strike at. You cannot argue with results. You can only sit down. Cassia looked across the churchyard at the Duke, who was in conversation with Mr. Prentice about the next phase of the wall, and who had not glanced in her direction since the meeting ended, and who was giving her the room to decide what the evening meant without his presence shaping the conclusion. He defended the work, Cassia said quietly. He defended the woman who did the work, Mrs. Sorrel said, by making it impossible to separate the two, which is either the most intelligent or the most deliberate thing I have witnessed in this village, and I am quite certain it is both. Cassia stood in the churchyard and thought about what had happened. She thought about someone who had been given terms and had met them, who had carried timber and studied cracks and learned her orchard, and who had, when the moment demanded it, used the full weight of who he was, not to rescue her, but to state what she had built in language the room could not dismiss. She thought, he did not defend a guest. He defended something he has not yet said aloud. She thought, and I am going to have to decide very soon what to do about that. He came to Briarstone on Sunday morning. He walked from the village, as he had every morning since arriving, But this time, he came directly to the gate, rather than to the seawall, which told her something about the nature of the visit before a word had been spoken. She was in the garden. She had been there since early morning, not working, which was unusual, but sitting on the stone bench near the east wall with a cup of tea and the view of the channel and the particular stillness that arrived when she stopped organizing things and allowed them to settle. She saw him on the path. She watched him reach the gate and stop. He did not call out. He did not knock. He stood with the patience of someone who had learned, across 3 weeks in a Dorset village, that this particular gate opened on a schedule he did not control, and that the schedule was worth honoring. She put down her tea. She walked to the gate. She looked at him through the ironwork. "You were at the meeting last night," she said. "I was. You said what you said." "I did." She looked at his hands, resting at his sides, hands that had carried stone and timber and survey maps for 3 weeks and were not reaching for the latch because he had understood that this gate wasn't his to open. She opened it. He looked at the open gate. He did not step through immediately, and in that pause she understood that he recognized the significance and was letting the moment carry the weight it had earned. He stepped through. They walked together up the path toward the house, and the October morning was still, and the sea was calm beyond the bluff, and neither spoke until they reached the bench where her tea was cooling. "Sit," she said. Not a social invitation. The instruction of someone who had decided the next conversation required them both to be settled before it began. He sat. She sat beside him. The channel stretched below them, gray and quiet. "I want to tell you something about Hampshire," she said. "When you called me a guest," she said, "I understood what you were doing. Not in that moment. In that moment I was angry, and the anger was earned, and I do not withdraw it. But between the drawing room and my bedroom door, I understood." She paused. "You were not dismissing me. You were dismissing the possibility of me. Because the last time that possibility existed for someone in your family, your mother spent 20 years being diminished by people she should never have had to endure, and you decided you would not put another woman in that position." He did not move. His gaze went to the sea. "You called me a guest because a guest leaves, and a guest is not damaged by the leaving, and you could let a guest go without believing you had caused something irreparable. You used courtesy as a distance." She kept her eyes on the horizon. "I understood all of it. That is why I closed the door quietly instead of arguing. Because arguing would have required you to defend a position you held for reasons that had nothing to do with me, and defending it aloud would have made it harder to revise in private." Silence held for a long time. "You knew," he said. "I knew before I reached the corridor. And you left, anyway." "I left because I knew. Staying would have forced a confrontation. Leaving was a question." She turned to him. "I was asking whether you would answer it." He looked at the sea wall below them. The new stone fitted against the old, holding. "I spent 3 days after you left Hampshire attempting to resume the life I had been living before you entered it," he said. "I reviewed the accounts. I met with my steward. I attended to every duty. And none of it held, because every room I walked into contained a question you had left in it. And the question was whether I was living carefully or simply living small." He paused. "My mother never regretted the choice. I told you that under the wall. What I didn't tell you is that she asked me once, near the end, not to repeat her mistake. I spent 6 years believing she meant the marriage. It took your sea wall to understand. She meant the caution. She meant," he said, "that the cost of the choice was real, but the cost of refusing it was something she had watched me begin to pay, and she did not want me to finish." He looked at her. The expression on his face had nothing guarded in it, nothing managed. Just the man in the open air, without a wall of any kind between them. "I am not your mother," Cassia said. "I am not a repetition of your father's history, and I am not a test of whether you have learned from it. I am a woman who sat in a Hampshire library and discussed coastal engineering until the candles burned down, and who was called a guest the following week, and who has spent every day since deciding whether the man who said that word was the same man who meant the conversation." She paused. "They are not the same man. I have known that since you arrived at my gate." "Which man am I now?" he said. She looked at the open gate at the bottom of the garden, the one she had opened, the one he had walked through. "You are the one who is here," she said, "on my ground, having come through my gate. That is the man I am talking to." He placed his hand beside hers on the stone bench, close enough that the distance was a choice rather than a fact, and waited. She closed the distance. Her hand rested over his, briefly, firmly, the way she did everything she had decided about. "The sea wall," she said. "Is holding," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." They sat on the bench in the October morning and looked at the channel and the repaired wall and the open gate below them, and the conversation that followed was about the orchard and the tenant cottages and the next phase of work, and it was about none of those things, and both of them knew it, and neither needed to say so, because the gate was open, and the wall was holding, and that was enough for one Sunday morning in Dorset. She invited him to stay for the afternoon. This was the first time she had invited him to Briarstone, for any reason that was not the seawall or the orchard or the estate accounts, and they both understood the distinction, and neither remarked on it. They worked in the library. She had converted the Briarstone library into a working office within her first week, the shelves reorganized by subject, the desk positioned for morning light, the survey maps pinned beside the window. It was the room that most closely resembled her, and she had chosen it for this afternoon deliberately, because the conversation approaching required her to be in the place where she was most entirely herself. He sat across from her at the desk. They reviewed the remaining seawall estimates. They discussed old Gareth's grafting plan for the orchard. They talked about the tenant cottages, the cost of the roof repairs, the drainage work that would follow the wall's completion. They discussed all of it with the attention of two people conducting business, and the awareness of two people who understood that the business was a bridge to something the business could not hold. It was past 4 when the light shifted. October afternoons on the Dorset coast carried a particular quality. The sun dropping toward the channel, the room flooding with warm lateral light that stripped away shadow and pretense. Cassia set down her pen. "I want to say something," she said. He set down the estimate. He gave her his full attention, the unguarded version she had first seen at the gate and had been seeing with increasing frequency since, the one that carried nothing of Hampshire and everything of the man who had carried her stone. "When I left Hampshire," she said, "I told Ivo that it did not matter how a man watched you leave, that it mattered entirely what he did afterward." She paused. "You arrived at my gate 3 days later. I turned you away. You stayed. I set terms designed to make attachment impossible, and you met everyone without asking me to revise a single condition." She looked at the survey maps on the wall, the orchard schedule, the seawall plan, the evidence of 3 weeks of work done side by side under conditions she had designed to prevent exactly what was happening in this room. "I set those terms because I was afraid," she said, "not of you, of being seen as the woman who chased a duke to Dorset, of proving my mother correct. I made the terms about competence because competence was the thing no one could dismiss as sentiment." She met his gaze. "But the terms were not honest. They were a wall. My version of your word guest. A way of keeping you close enough to see and far enough away to survive losing." I do not want to survive losing you, she said. I would rather be the woman who sat in a kitchen during a Dorset rainstorm discussing tidal engineering with a man who had taken off his coat than the woman who kept her terms intact and her walls standing and never once said what was true. He stood. He came around the desk. He stood before her chair, and she stood, because this was not a conversation for sitting. And they were very close in the Briarstone library, with the October light coming through the window and the survey maps surrounding them, and 3 weeks of carefully maintained distance dissolving between them. You called me a guest, she said. What would you call me now? He looked at the library she had built around herself, the desk and the maps and the organized shelves, and at the woman standing at the center of it, who had just dismantled her own wall with the same precision she used to build everything else. Necessary, he said. She looked at him. Not guest, he said. Not visitor. Not a situation with a natural term. He paused. When you closed the door in Hampshire, I stood at that window and tried to find the word for what I had just allowed to walk out of the room. Guest was what I had said. It wasn't what was true. I have spent every day since searching for the right word. He held her gaze. Necessary is the closest I have come. And it is not close enough, but it is honest. She put her hand on his arm, flat and deliberate, the way she touched things she had decided about. Theron, she said. His name. She had never spoken it. It had been your grace and the Duke and the careful absence where a name might go, and now the name was in the Briarstone library, and neither of them could take it back. Cassia, he said, and her name in his voice sounded like the end of a policy and the beginning of something that did not require management and did not want it. He kissed her. It was not cautious. It carried the honesty of someone who had spent 3 weeks carrying stone and meeting terms and revising every position he had held, and who had arrived at a conclusion he was no longer willing to postpone. She kissed him back with the same precision she brought to sea walls and orchard plans and every true thing she had ever decided, and the library was warm with the last of the October light, and the survey maps were on the desk, and neither of them required any further terms. When they separated, she kept her hand on his arm and looked at him with the expression she wore when she had stopped managing everything and was simply present. The seawall, she said. Is holding, he said. The orchard. Will be magnificent. The terms. I believe the terms have been comprehensively revised. They have, she said, by mutual agreement. He held her hand. She let him hold it. The October afternoon moved on outside the library window, and the channel was calm, and the wall held, and everything had been said that needed saying first, and neither of them was in any hurry to say what came next, because it would come, and they both knew it, and the knowing was its own kind of arrival. The Duke proposed formally on Wednesday. He did it in the Briarstone library, which she had expected, and standing rather than kneeling, which she had also expected, and with a directness that matched her own, which she had hoped for, but had not been certain of until the moment arrived. I have been conducting an assessment, he said, of the seawall, of whether I am capable of spending the rest of my life being told that my schedules are wrong, and my orchard management is deficient, and my library system lacks any rational foundation. She looked at him. And what is your conclusion? That I cannot envision any alternative I would find tolerable. She considered this. That is not precisely a declaration. It is the most honest version of one I am capable of producing, he said. The less honest version involves more poetry, and none of the truth. She extended her hand. He looked at it, and then at her, and shook it, which was absurd as a response to a proposal of marriage, and which was also the most accurate gesture available to two people who had built their entire understanding of each other on handshakes across crumbling walls and agreements made in the rain. "I accept your assessment," she said, "on the condition that the library reorganization begins immediately." "I would expect nothing else," he said. Ivo knew before she told him. This was the cost of a brother who had spent 26 years paying close attention to a sister who believed herself difficult to read. He was on the sea wall the following morning, looking at the channel with the patient expression of someone who had been waiting for this conversation and had decided to let it arrive at its own pace. "Well," he said. "We have reached an agreement," she said. "An agreement?" He looked at her. "Is that what it is called when a duke carries your timber for 3 weeks and looks at your stonework the way other men look at cathedral windows?" She sat beside him on the wall. The morning was clear, and the repaired stone was solid beneath them, and the lower fields were dry. "He asked what he should call me," she said, since guest was no longer accurate. "And what did he choose?" She looked at the channel. "Necessary." Ivo was quiet. "Our mother is going to have a considerable reaction. Our mother sent me to Dorset to forget a duke. The duke followed me to Dorset. I put him to work on a seawall. He rebuilt my wall, surveyed my orchard, and revised every position he had held about people like us." She paused. "If she objects to the result, she will have to argue it with the stonework." Ivo looked at her with the expression of someone who had been protecting this person since she was small and had recognized, in the way that understanding sometimes arrives complete, that she had not required protection for quite some time, and that knowing this did not remove the instinct, but changed its shape. "Is he good enough for you?" he said. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "He is becoming so," she said, "which I find more persuasive than if he had arrived that way." Ivo nodded. "It is more persuasive," he agreed. He looked at the wall beneath them. "And this is holding." "It is holding." "Then so is my opinion." Mrs. Sorrel received the news with the composure of someone who had been in possession of it for at least a week. She arrived that afternoon with bread, preserved plums, and the calm satisfaction of a forecast confirmed. "The village is delighted," she said, which was her way of reporting that the village had been speculating at volume and was now experiencing the collective satisfaction of having been right. "He is good with his hands. That is what Saltmere knows. That he came here for you and stayed for the work and did not once carry himself as though either was beneath him. In this village, that is the full measure of a man." Cassia looked at Miss Sorrel, who had been her first ally in Dorset and her most reliable mirror, and who was watching her now with an expression that combined satisfaction with something more tender, the look of someone who had seen a woman arrive as an exile and was watching her leave that word behind. "Thank you," Cassia said, "for the plums and for everything that came before them." "The plums are excellent this year," Mrs. Sorrel said. "Everything else was simply a matter of paying attention." Her mother's letter arrived on Thursday. It ran to 4 pages and moved through alarm, disbelief, and reluctant recalculation, with the efficiency of someone revising positions she had held with great certainty. Cassia replied in 1 page, because 1 page was sufficient, and brevity carried its own authority. She wrote that the Duke had come of his own choosing, that he had worked, that he had earned the respect of the village and the confidence of her own judgment, which was the judgment her mother had spent 23 years developing and was now required to trust. She wrote that she would bring him to Bristol when the seawall was completed, because they had agreed to see what remained when the work was done, and what remained was considerable. She did not write that she was happy. Her mother would see it in Bristol, or she would not. Some truths could not be argued into acceptance. They could only be shown. Lord Adderley offered his congratulations at the Saltmere Sunday service. He did so with the careful grace of someone who understood that the woman he had challenged in a church hall was about to become a duchess, and that duchesses had long memories and independent access to quarries. "Miss Renward," he said in the churchyard, "I wish you every happiness." "Thank you, Lord Adderley," she said. "Your stone has held beautifully." He smiled. She smiled. The exchange was brief and complete, though Mrs. Sorrel supplied commentary anyway on the walk home, and Cassia permitted herself to enjoy it. They were married in November at the Saltmere Church, which sat above the village, with a view of the sea and the coast road, and the Briarstone Gate visible in the distance, where a carriage had stopped 5 weeks earlier, and everything that followed had begun. She wore dark blue. Theron had not been surprised. Evo had not been surprised. Her mother, who had arrived from Bristol 3 days before the ceremony, with the composed resolve of someone adjusting to circumstances she had not authorized, looked at the dress and said nothing, which from her mother was its own kind of acceptance. Her father came. He was a quiet man who had built a shipping company from a single vessel and raised a daughter who could read a contract and a room with equal clarity, and he walked her up the aisle with the steady pace of someone who understood that this particular cargo was the most valuable he had ever carried and the most certain of its destination. Cassia looked at Theron at the front of the church and thought about every door between them. The drawing-room door she had closed in Hampshire, the iron gate she had refused to open, the kitchen door she had opened in the rain, the garden gate on a Sunday morning, the library where she had spoken his name and he had spoken hers, and neither of them could retrieve the words. She thought about the word guest and how it had traveled from Hampshire to Dorset, and from wound to understanding, and from locked gate to open one, and how a single word spoken in a single room on a single evening had set everything in motion. Saltmere turned out. The full village, Mrs. Sorrel in the second row, with the expression of someone who had been providing intelligence since October and considered the wedding the natural conclusion of a well-managed campaign. Old Gareth at the back, who nodded once as Cassia passed. Mr. Prentice and the Holt boy, who had carried stone alongside a duke and were not particularly moved by the formality, which was a tribute in itself. Cassia reached the front of the church. Theron looked at her with the expression she now kept, the unguarded one, the one that meant only her, only this, only the truth of someone who had walked to a gate and waited and had not left when it stayed closed. She did not close any door. She did not turn from any window. She took his hand. He held it with the firm, steady grip of someone who meant what he agreed to and who did not let go. After the ceremony, in the churchyard, in the November light that was sharp and clean, her father found her. "Well," he said. She looked at the Briarstone Gate, visible from the hill, the iron gate where a duke's carriage had stopped 5 weeks ago, and she had said no, and meant not yet, and had understood the difference. "He came to my gate," she said. "I did not open it. He stayed. He carried my stone, and repaired my wall, and learned my orchard. And when someone questioned whether I belonged, he stood in a room and listed everything I had built, until there was nothing left to question." Her father looked at her with the attention of someone who had been watching this person for 23 years, and had never once been disappointed by what he saw. "And the gate?" he said. She looked at it. The iron gate on the coast road, the one that had been closed and opened and closed and opened, and that now stood, as she had instructed Mrs. Holt to leave it that morning, simply and completely open. "The gate is his," she said. "It has been his, since he chose to stay." Theron found her at the edge of the churchyard, looking at the view she had been watching since October. The sea, the bluff, the lower fields running dry, the wall holding steady, the gate standing open. "The sea wall," she said. "Holding," he said. "The orchard. Gareth says it will be the finest season in years." The gate. He looked at the gate below them, standing open on the coast road in the November light. The gate was never about the iron, he said. It was about the woman who decided when it opened. She thought about all the versions of the gate. Closed in October because she was not ready. Opened on a Sunday because she was. And now standing open with no one beside it because it no longer required a keeper. "Theron," she said. "Cassia," he said, and her name in his voice had all of Hampshire and all of Dorset in it, and none of it was a wound anymore, and all of it was home. The November afternoon went on around them, sharp and unhurried, and the sea moved below the bluff, and the wall held, and the gate stood open, and neither of them needed to manage any of it, because the strongest things, her father had always said, were not the ones you built to keep people out. They were the ones you trusted enough to leave open. She trusted this one completely.